Welcome back. My name is Sam Hassel, and in today's episode, we are going to be discussing 10 ways to build an admissions hook. So in prior episodes, in our Building an Admissions Hook, How to Build an Admissions Hook episode, we discussed more of the strategic factors for building an admissions hook. And for those who don't know to what I am referring, when we say an admissions hook, we mean a defined narrative or theme or brand to a student's candidacy, and that theme really being used to help to create a very coherent, easy to understand picture of what a student represents in terms of the incoming freshman class. And so we've talked a lot about different admissions narratives or hooks, such as a student who is interested in cognitive science or behavioral economics or behavioral ecology or social entrepreneurship, or aerospace engineering, or the intersection of aerospace engineering with history or women's rights. Having a defined focus that can, in many cases, sit at the intersection of multiple disciplines, ideally is as niche as possible, though it doesn't have to start out being extremely niche. It can become more niche over time or bring in other disciplines. But really having some sort of focus, something that you can sell the college on, in the same way that if you are applying to a company for a position, and a lot of this college admissions process at the elite levels at the most selective institutions that we focus upon is really most analogous to a job application. It is not that I'm going to come to your company and I'm going to be head of human resources and a COO and a CFO and a CEO, but I am coming to your college to study a specific field or set of fields. And again, there can be a mixture. It doesn't always have to be just one singular discipline, but I am coming to your school to understand how I can learn more about psychology to leverage that in my business, for example. And that is a past narrative of a student that was very interesting, sort of motivating this psychological perspective of business and saying, well, I can take this class on consumer psychology and I could work with this research professor at your college. And since I've already I've started a business in high school, I'm sort of acquiring these tools, and you could sort of see the continuity of the narrative at a college level. And it's the same thing, again, in terms of a job application. What specific niche role are you going to occupy at the company? We don't need, at least for any company of even moderate size. Maybe if it's a very small startup, then maybe you do have a bunch of generalists and people who are doing a wide variety of tasks and wearing many hats. But certainly for many mid-size or larger size companies, it's very specialized and siloed. You're coming to that company, you're putting an application to fulfill a very particular role. And that is how college admissions, particularly at the highest levels, functions. At the elite schools that we focus on in this podcast. And there are also, as I've probably alluded to a couple of times subtly, there are also even subtle psychological constraints. When you are reading so many applications and they tend to look very similar with very similar activities, and it's all over the place, the student does music and they play a sport and they it's very hard to understand what this student represents. And that creates a lot of frustration, psychological agitation. You don't want to, as I've said before, and I've said this on a podcast with Thomas Khalil, former Dean of Admissions at Wharton, and we discussed this. They don't want to be Sherlock Holmes. The admissions officer doesn't want to be playing the role of detective, and what does X activity have to do with Y activity, with Z activity, and why, if they're majoring or saying that they're going to major in this field, why are their standardized test scores lower on those sections that are related to that field? Why are their SAT math scores much lower than their verbal scores, yet they're saying they want to be an engineer? Why didn't they take calculus-based physics and they're saying they want to be an engineer? Why are they saying they want to do business when they've never done anything related to business before? And so you don't want to, in those 8 or 10 minutes, that you're given for your application, you don't want to create frustration or anxiety. They have to piece it together. You want to make it as simple for them as it possibly can be. Now, unfortunately, simplicity for the admissions officer in a lot of cases means complexity for the applicants, right? Because a lot of people have a lot of angst and anxiety. Focus is not always very easy, and I think it's very difficult for many students, even many adults, to be focused on something and say no to a bunch of alternatives and to avoid the shiny object syndrome and all these other distractions. It's not easy. And so having to sort through that complexity and really audit, what am I uniquely good at and what am I uniquely passionate about? Not what I have to do forever for the entire rest of my life, but at least what is a defined direction that I can spend the next year, 2 years, 3 years of my high school career, maybe even 4 years, and really see where this can go. If I focus on this and I'm very consistent, what can I turn this into? And the answer very often is you can turn it into something quite tremendous if you are willing to narrow your aperture and focus instead of on 18 different things, which is by definition not focused, to sort of narrow that aperture and really start getting closer to what are some of the probabilistic angles based on the evidence that you've accrued to date. Even if it's middle school classes, you've always been, I say a lot of times, students, if you ask them the question in the positive direction, what do you want to do for the rest of your life? Or what do you want to do for your career? That's a terrible frame and terrible question to ask a student. I don't think I've ever asked a single student that question. I would never ask a student that question. It's too daunting. It's too weighty. It's too hard to predict the entire future. It's too hard to predict even the next 3 years, let alone 5, 10, etc. That's a very difficult question, and very few students have a very confident answer to that question. What you want to do is you want to back into it by looking at the evidence and the history and saying, yeah, I'm not 100% sure that I want to do this particular thing in STEM, but I do know, like, I'm always been much more passionate about STEM. I've always been much more of a science student. And they can at least tell you I'm definitely not an English student, right? I'm definitely not going to, you can start crossing things off and you can back into it by process elimination. But the important part is that it's evidence-based. It has to be based on evidence. It can't be based on nebulous future projections of, I want this very specific, career because it has this very particular salary. You can play that game if you want to, but I'm telling you, you're setting yourself for a lot of liabilities in the process, because if you're not really passionate, and this is not an honest assessment and introspection as to what you are uniquely good at or strong at, or what you're uniquely passionate about, it's going to be very, very difficult to pull that together into a narrative and focus on a subset of themes or activities or academic disciplines unless you are very passionate about them. And I understand that a lot of people are trying to play that game. They're trying to play the game of, what is the prestige career, as I've mentioned. You have to understand there's a million other people who are playing that exact same game, and it's a very crowded field. And it might be pulling yourself through the mud, basically. Like, we're going to be dragging you and dragging you and dragging you to get you to become a business kid when you're not a business kid, unfortunately. So you have to be very honest in this process of auditing what that trajectory should be, but it's not a trajectory forever, right? And I often say to our team and in business, a lot of people confuse a season with forever. There's a difference between a season and an eternity. You could be going through a difficult time. You could have a week where you have 6 different tests. It might even last a couple of months when you have a lot of, this happens to many students, there's a lot of converging streams. They're in junior year. Those are the most important grades. All of a sudden, they're in a ton of AP classes where their school didn't have any AP classes in the prior grades. Now they're doing SAT prep. Their resume building's ongoing. And, you get some seasons where things get very difficult. And I think it's very important to distinguish between a season and, as I said, like eternity or forever.
the best way to view this building an admissions hook and building a narrative is you are trying to head in the most probabilistic directions based on the current evidence that you have. If you are running a race and you see, I'm ahead in the race because I'm just more talented, I'm better at this discipline, or in the 800 meters, you would want to play that game. You would want to play the game that is to your strengths. You don't want to play a game that is to other people's strengths. That's especially a crowded field that you're going to go into. There's a whole bunch of people who are much more interested in it than you are. They're going to have a significant advantage. They've shown more promise or talent or ability in that field. You want to really be honest, and you don't even have to take into account these strategic considerations. Anybody can do whatever they want. Any student listening, any parent listening could do whatever you want. You can, have a strategic positioning. You can go into another field that you have no evidence for, such as business or medicine, and that the student hasn't really shown any particular high degree of aptitude or propensity for or interest for. There are all these students who say they want to do business. They've never looked up a single thing about business in their entire life. If you want to do business, why have you never even looked up a single YouTube video or done a single Google search to find out anything about business if you're so interested in business, right? So you can play that game. You can veer away from the evidence. You can veer away from your hobbies, your interests, some of your informal passions that you're not even paying attention to, but are actually extremely indicative of what you're passionate about, because it's how you choose to spend your time when nobody's looking. Nobody's looking, nobody's grading you on anything, nobody's forcing you to do anything. That tends to be a very honest signal. So anybody can do whatever they want. I will say that our approach and the philosophy of our program, my very strong entrenched philosophy is you need to be very introspective, very honest, and look at how you spend your time, what you're better at. You can back into it by doing a proselytization exercise and say, listen, I really don't like those things, and so at least we can start Xing some of those things off. But you will have a lot of evidence. There are subjects that a student has gravitated to even by middle school. There are ways that they spend their time, and there is a lot of evidence to at least start narrowing, as I said, the aperture and coming up with a trajectory and sort of really an investment strategy to say that we're going to really invest in these 1 or 2 or 3 areas, not play this game where my time is divided, my attention is divided. I had the shiny object syndrome. If anybody asked me to do this, or my friend asked me to go out, just my time is just totally not my own time, and it has no strategic notion to it of how I need to allocate my time to accomplish my goals. And of course, there needs to be both an intrinsic motivation. So it needs to be, as I've mentioned earlier, they need to be very intrinsically motivated to by what they're pursuing. And then there's an extrinsic motivation too, which is, of course, a lot of the theme of this podcast, which is for students who have very high goals for themselves and their futures. They want to go to a very competitive school. They want to be around like-minded, very intellectual, very motivated peers, and want to go to these different, be parts of these different academic communities. Then that is an extrinsic motivation. You're not going to have the most powerful motivation by having one or the other, intrinsic or extrinsic. I think intrinsic's definitely a more sustainable fuel. So if a student's very passionate about something, or they can really audit their strengths and their, what really intrigues them the most, it's probably stronger fuel in a lot of cases than something that's extrinsic. But I think the combination of the two is the most powerful. Having both a defined goal, wanting to attend one of these institutions, hopefully that relates to your passion, because you can see how this community will enable you to further pursue that passion. But having both that extrinsic combined with the intrinsic, because to build a very long-running admission story over multiple years, particularly, it's much easier if you're 6 months out from the application process and you have to fake a passion for 6 months. You could probably grit your teeth and do it. There are some people who can grit their teeth for 3 years, but it's very hard. And it's like pulling teeth or pulling a kid through the mud, as I've said. So to make it a lot easier and to sort of have your cake and eat it too, if you want to go to an excellent college and you want to be the type of student that they're looking for, which is a student who has some, focus or passion or hook, as we've called it, you have to really be honest and audit what are you interested in, and use that both intrinsic energy and motivation and momentum, along with the extrinsic driver and motivation to attend one of those top colleges. Now, that's a lot of my rant on sort of the background of the focus and the hook and why it's important to have a hook, why it's important from a psychological perspective. As an admissions officer who's reading this, it doesn't want to be confused and not understand what you represent and what role you'll play in this school, which is essentially, again, analogous to a company. Are you going to be the head of HR? Are you the COO? Are you the marketing? Are you chief of marketing? What specific role are you going to play? It's much simpler. It's much easier. And unfortunately, there might be a little bit more complexity, again, that you have to pay up front and sort of really being introspective and auditing this. But that complexity comes at the upside of making it much more simple for an admissions officer to read your file and to really understand. And it doesn't have to be absolutely definitive, but it has to be presented in a very definitive manner, right? If you're on a plane and the pilot is, telling you every little thing, and I'm not sure if the winds are going to be like this or a pilot's very definitive. When you go in for an interview, you should be definitive and know what you represent. You don't go into a job interview wearing your pajamas, just doing anything that you want to do, and you just say, I think I'm going to do this for 2 years, but I'm not really sure if I want to do this other thing, and maybe in 10 years I'll do this, and actually I have all these other interests that aren't related to this job capacity, and I think I might want to come to your company and play this role, but I'm not really sure, maybe I want to play this role, or actually, I might want to play this other role. It's not compelling, right? And I think a lot of people understand this at a psychological level, that the people who come across the best have a certain amount of confidence and certainty. And there's a difference between some front-end certainty, right? That's what's presented. If you go for that job interview, you do have to, there is a little bit of a playing a game, right? There's a little bit of gamesmanship. There's a little bit of presentation, what comes off the best. That doesn't have to be that on the back end that you 100% have figured everything out and what the next 25 years of your life looks like in terms of your career and where this is all going. And so I want to sort of disentangle some of those misconceptions. We keep sort of facing some of them as I do intro calls with families, and I think people are very lost, very indecisive, because they misinterpret, I think, a lot of what we mean by building an admissions. Like, it doesn't need to be something forever. That would be great. And certainly you're hoping that what you're auditing as your unique passions and unique gifts, hopefully you are building and going on that trajectory and starting that trajectory, and hopefully that will continue in college and beyond in your career, and you have an early start. But regardless, the amount of focus and concentration and excellence and the skills that you will learn along the way are not domain specific in a lot of cases. So you can end up pivoting and veering off the course later on, but you will have learned extremely important skills by getting good at something, learning to concentrate, learning to focus, to not just throw away your time or give it away to anybody, or the shiny object syndrome of every single thing, every single person who asks you, can you do this? Can you do this? Can you do this? Your time is is totally on offer to other people. It is by being focused, starting to concentrate, starting to come up with some themes, starting to audit what you're uniquely good at, what you're uniquely passionate about, that will serve you regardless. So that is my sort of preface here in terms of the building of admissions hook, some sort of philosophy, some psychology to it, why it works, what it needs to be, what it doesn't necessarily need to be, i.e. A determination of the next 40 years of your life. And for those who are further interested in some more of the background or the contextual factors, again, I would refer you to that Building an Admissions Hook or How to Build an Admissions Hook episode that we had earlier on the podcast. That is a much more strategic episode. So it's a lot more picking the path, auditing the evidence, understanding what are very common fields or very common admissions narratives that you might want to avoid, perhaps. Particularly areas, as I've discussed, that might not, like, they're just not necessary to position yourself for. And so there's a lot of extra considerations there. A lot of schools don't have business programs at an undergraduate level. No institutions in the United States have an undergraduate medical school. They might have a bachelor's MD program that's very specialized. So I would refer some people to the Building an Admissions Hook episode if you want a lot more of the strategy side of building an admissions hook, and a focus. This episode, beyond my little preface there, is going to be a little bit more tactical oriented. And so in this episode, we're going to get into more of the 10 ways to build an admissions hook. And this is really I'm not going to focus as much on the metrics. So by metrics, I mean your grades, your course rigor, the number of APs, your test scores. Those are metrics. They're numbers, they're quantifiable, your class rank, etc. Those are numbers. And as I've mentioned on this podcast many times, when you're talking about the highly selective schools, particularly the highly selective schools, students who have excellent grades, take many APs, have great test scores, those are necessary factors for admission, but they're not sufficient for getting you in and of themselves anymore. So I'm not going to talk too much about the metrics. Hopefully it's been established and it's fairly clear to many people that if you are targeting the most selective institutions in the United States, the top 25 or so name brand institutions, national research universities, maybe some of the very top liberal arts colleges, for those schools, of course, you have to have excellent grades, really be a straight A student or very close, taking near or max course rigor, and ideally possessing very strong test scores that you can submit to those schools, ideally in the 99th percentile. That should hopefully just be understood. That is just the foundation that is not sufficient for you gaining admission in many cases to those top and most selective institutions. That being said, of course, some of your metrics, again, if you're positioning yourself under an engineering narrative for an engineering focus or hook, of course, they're going to look at your metrics and say, if there's any variation in terms of some of the grades, if there's some A pluses, some A's and A minuses, you wouldn't want the A minuses if you're positioning for engineering to be in your, engineering relevant classes. You want your A pluses to be in more of your math or science classes, and maybe your A minuses are in the social sciences or humanities classes that are less relevant. When I'm looking at your test scores, of course, I would want your ACT math and ACT science to be, if there's any variability. Of course, it's great if you just have 36s across the board on the ACT and every section's perfect. But if there's any variation, or, a student might have a 33 ACT overall, which is close to the 99th percentile, but they might have a 29 on the science section. That does not look great if you're positioning yourself for engineering, or even more so the math section. Nowadays, given that the ACT science is going to become optional in the future, the math section, the SAT math section, it doesn't look great if there's an imbalance and between the subsection scores and you're positioning for something that's more STEM or more math leaning, but that's actually the lower score by a non-trivial margin versus your verbal score. So of course the metrics, the subsections, what the subjects are, those sections on your standardized testing, where did you challenge yourself the most? Conversely, if you're a humanities student or you're positioning for something that's social science related, you're going to go be an English major in college, or that's at least, again, how you're positioning, or the intended major that you're listing in the application. Different in a lot of cases from what you can actually major in, because you can change it in almost the vast majority of cases. You can change your major. So in a lot of cases, again, this is sort of differentiating that these are placeholders for the vast majority of schools and the vast majority of fields in terms of what you're listing in terms of your major interest at many, many top schools. So, but if you are listing, if your strongest position is English, of course, you want to have excellent course rigor. I've taken AP Lang, AP Lit if it's offered, or again, depending on what your high school is. You want to have challenged yourself in terms of your metrics that's related to that area. If you can, if that's afforded to you, you want to have top grades in that area, that would be relevant. And of course, again, sections on standardized testing, that would be relevant to that area. So that's the metrics part. And there is a metrics part or metrics, support to the admissions hook. However, a lot of the admissions hook is really built through activities and soft factors such as the resume, the admissions essays, and again, more of these, the recommendation letters, more of these soft factors tend to really buttress the admissions hook even more so. So in this episode, I want to get into more of those soft factor elements versus the metric or the hard factor elements that really would support at more a tactical level, right? This is more things that you're doing. Again, strategy versus tactic. Strategy is, for example, how do we pick the admissions hook? How do we audit it? Understanding what fields are a little bit more crowded, that you might not want to go down that path and engineer a 3-year trajectory in a very crowded field in which you might be very demographically overrepresented and there's no payout at the end because it doesn't even matter anyway. There's no very specific. You can, again, if you want to do medicine, you have a lot of strategic latitude to apply for whatever majors you want. You're going to be in the arts and sciences college regardless at just essentially any institution. Maybe in some cases, there's some students that are going to be in the engineering school and then end up doing, pre-med. But you have a lot of strategic latitude for different majors in different fields. So there's that strategy. That is our prior episode. Today is going to be a little bit more about what are some of these categories of activities. Particularly, we're going to be focused on the resume. What are 10 different categories or means by which you can build an admissions hook and support it. So this is more tactical. This is more concrete actions versus the auditing of the admissions hook per se. So for number one, all of that out of the way now. For number one, we of course have high school clubs. So for high school clubs, these are obviously there are going to be pros and there are going to be cons to a lot of these different activity types that I'm going to list. For clubs, there are many pros, and I would say clubs are probably one of the core foundations or building blocks of many students' resumes and their admissions hook. It's not going to be the most standout in a lot of cases, be the most unique activity, and that's where it's going to have a bit of a con. So because you have 30,000 high schools in the United States and essentially all of them have clubs, you have to keep in mind that there are many common clubs that just exist at every single high school. And so if you're talking about a school newspaper, for example, that you're a part of, well, you have to understand there's probably pretty close to about 30,000 school newspapers, right? It's not going to be exactly 30,000. I'm sure there are some schools that don't possibly have a school newspaper, but it's probably not going to be too far off. Just about every single high school I've come across has a high school newspaper or some sort of club, something that's related to that. So when we're talking about clubs, the pros are they're very easily accessible. They're right in front of you. You go to that school, and that makes it very easy. They're right there. They're structured. You have club meetings in your school that you attend during most of the day, and you can just append these clubs or have these club meetings after school or certain hours. They're with the same students that you go to school. So it's right in front of you. It's not a research opportunity that's maybe with a mentor who's halfway across the country at another university where it's not easy to get to their lab. It's right in front of you. That's a pro. However, a lot of times, and this is true with students, as with people, as with activities and resume builders, a lot of times the strength of some things is also its weakness. So also, because it's very readily available to many students, because nearly all students attend a high school that has a wide array of clubs, and that's right there, right in front of them, this creates what's known in psychology as availability bias, which is, it's just it's right there. So that makes it very common. So a lot of students who are applying to colleges, of course, are going to have a lot of these clubs in their resume. They're going to be in the newspaper and DECA and Key Club. And So the thing that actually makes it a bit of a strength, or one of the advantages of a high school club, is also what actually presents a bit of a weakness. So its pro is also a bit of its con, right? The fact that it's so available, whatever is easily accessible and has not very many barriers, doesn't actually keep a lot of other people out, right? Which means it's just not going to be as unique, unfortunately. And I discuss this a lot in the context of early decision being a binding commitment. A lot of students don't like the binding nature of early decision. They view it as limiting their options. However, that weakness is also its strength. If you apply under an ED plan, you might be in a group of 3,000 students getting the first read of the entire admission cycle when those admissions officers are super fresh and haven't reviewed any applications yet, and you're much more likely to be the first kid that they've seen who has this passion, versus keeping all your options open, doing regular decision, but now that barrier to entry has been entirely taken down. Now the floodgates are open to 60,000 students. And now you're in January and they're reviewing all these applications and they already took all the ED kids and filled half of their class that way. So you have to understand a lot of strengths or pros to a certain maneuver or activity can also be its downside as well, or a limitation. So in terms of clubs, pro, very accessible. Con is like they're not going to be as unique, right? Also because of the accessibility. If something is more accessible, it motivates the importance of you going a lot deeper or being a lot more unique. So this is also true of things like if you're in a very crowded field, such as business. If you're just a business kid, there's a ton of those kids, right? And this is why I've stressed the importance of niches. Or, okay, do you have another interest? This is where it's actually a bit to your benefit to have a little bit of a broader array of interests. Because now you could say, well, you know what, I really like business, but I also really like psychology. Bam, behavioral economics. Bam, consumer psychology, right? I really like business, but I also like sustainability. Bam, sustainable finance, right? So we really want to, the more common something is, the more you want to drill deeper into that vertical to really get the niche. So if you're looking at clubs, this is where it's important, again, to have nailed some of the strategic elements from the prior episode in the building admissions, so to really audit what sort of some of your unique areas of interest. And then you'd really like for the club to, of course, be relevant to that interest, right? So they're kind of more generic clubs, or sort of activities. Might not be a full sort of club in the proper sense, but you have things like National Honor Society. You have things such as Key Club. Again, you have newspaper. You have things that are just very common, and there are many students that are members of those clubs. But if there's a little bit more of a niche or weirder club that relates to your interest, or you can even creatively make it relevant to your interest or to your hook, now you're getting a little bit more niche or a little bit more unique, right? If it's a very specific, if it's philosophy club, there might not be a lot of students in philosophy. It doesn't even have to be that you're joining an existing club. You might be able to make a club from scratch because you say, you know what, I'm the student, I'm interested in the business of sustainable fashion, and I highly doubt your high school has a club that is devoted to that theme. It's extremely improbable. Now, of course, it's going to probably be a little bit more difficult. There's going to be some bureaucracy involved. It will depend on the high school. What do you have to go through to start a club? Some schools, it will be so easy. And again, that might not be as impressive because kids have started 78 different clubs at the school because it is so easy. And again, the difficulty versus the uniqueness is just a trade-off. The more difficult it is, the more rare it's likely to be. And so you have to find a way to reinterpret difficulty, right? A way of interpreting difficulty is this is hard, this sucks. Another way of interpreting difficulty is this is hard, this sucks, therefore most people won't do it. And so if it's not easy to start the club, well, there probably aren't as many kids who've done it historically at your school. There won't be as many students in your class who are doing it, and so you can reframe some of the difficulty. But you have to be able to view an opportunity there. If there's not a club, there's a little bit more of the low-hanging fruit if there's existing clubs and you can join them, or there's a club that's very relevant to your passion. It's not an either or. It can, a lot of times it's a both end. Let's do both, right? Join some of the existing clubs. Find a club that maybe on its surface maybe it's not the most relevant in terms of the name of the club, but you could flex it. So for example, if you're interested in business or a financial capacity, you're performing a financial capacity such as treasurer or fundraising or managing finances for the club, but the club isn't necessarily a financial or business-oriented club. It's something that maybe is related to sustainability, for example, but you're performing a business capacity, right? So identifying clubs at your school that are relevant to your missions hook and your narrative. In some cases, you might be able to flex or make them relevant by the function that you're performing or some other creative maneuver where you can find a connection or nexus point between your hook and, sort of what the name of the club is or what its purpose is. That's sort of the relevance components and existing clubs. If you need to build a new club from scratch to get a club that's relevant to your interest, then you can do that as well. And again, you can assemble both existing clubs and possibly also try to found new clubs. If you're a student or you have a student who's maybe not the best at working without structure, or they're not even just, it's not even necessarily that a student is this or they're not this. It's different time points, right? Some students have different maturity ramps and different self-starting ramps. And so it's not that they're not a self-starter or somebody who can't work without a lot of structure. It just might not be the time yet, right? So in some of those cases, it might be that if you know it's going to be a little bit hard for you to start this club all by yourself and you're not that type of student, or you have some friends and, this other club, or you need to use that as some motivation, then get going. Do something instead of doing nothing. You don't need to hit the grand slam. And I think a lot of people, again, one of the mistakes that I see a lot is people are trying to launch the nonprofit that changes the world because they think they have to launch the nonprofit that changes the world. And what ends up happening is they have such a lofty goal, they end up doing nothing because it creates so much activation energy that is required to get moving because the task is so daunting. And if you are that student, you have that student, you can start off by joining some existing clubs. For example, if you can't do it by yourself, but you really do want to found a club, see if you can get some friends, for example, or maybe some kids in younger grades or older grades, or somebody who has more experience can help you with it. So you can maneuver around, but you need to be honest and audit some of your strengths and where you're particularly at. Because at the end of the day, you need to get the job done. You need to do stuff. You don't need to worry about perfection. You need to do stuff and to iterate through. You're perfecting. You're not aiming for perfection. So those are some of the, what to do with clubs between existing, focusing on ones that are more relevant, possibly founding, again, understanding, are you more of a self-starter? Can you exist without outside of structure? Do you need some people to help you, or better going off to an existing club? How difficult is it at your school? If it's more difficult, there's more upside, but it might be so difficult that it's a massive time expenditure. Understanding there's pros and cons to clubs, right? The fact that they are very accessible to the vast majority of students at high schools in the United States, that will make them less rare. However, they are very accessible to you. So you should definitely take advantage of clubs. And again, understanding that it's going to be the depth of your contributions, how far you drill into them, can it be more niche? And really understanding that beyond the clubs, there's going to be a few different factors, which is it relevant? Can you make contributions? Can you do things in the club? Can you lead? Can you fundraise? Can you take initiative? What are those bullets going to be? Not just that you were there and not that you just attended, but what's going to be the depth? Can you do it for many years, ideally? Because continuity is going to go along with depth. And so it's relevant, it's deep, and that's ideally, it's even, if possible, a little bit more niche. It's not something like student council that just everybody is a part of, because that exists at nearly every single high school. So again, depth, uniqueness, a bit of nicheness, and relevance to the admissions narrative is going to be ideal. If you can check off 3 of those boxes, some of those clubs will actually start to now approximate on higher value activities. Even though they are very common, they're still a major building block for many students' resumes, even for students who go to, gain admission to the top in most selective institutions. Summer programs. So many of you likely know my stance on summer programs, which is not a very positive one. I won't go through the full arsenal of considerations here or that full view. We do have an earlier episode in which we unpacked the category of summer programs quite substantially. However, I will just sort of very quickly recap. Summer programs, there's a very small handful of ultra-selective, very meaningful top programs in particular fields. Those are very, very rare. There might be 20, 25, 30 of them in the entire country out of hundreds of different summer programs. The vast majority of pre-college summer programs or summer programs in general are not going to stand out. Many students do them. It can signal privilege. It can signal that you simply have a lot of money to spend on a summer program. They're hosted by third-party vendors who license the college's name, and that obviously gives it the branding that makes people think that it's a very special program because it has Stanford's name attached to it or Columbia's name attached to it, which is a great marketing scheme, but not particularly to the advantage of a student or to a family. So there are a lot of liabilities to summer programs. The vast majority of them I would not consider very high-value extracurriculars that differentiate students at the most selective institutions. However, their use cases will be primarily when it's, again, relevant to the student's admissions hook. It's going to be relevant to some of their interests, or if they have a few different interests and you're in the younger grades and you're trying to sort through, it can help you get some of that information. It's more intro level and needs to be more age appropriate. If you're doing just a standard pre-college summer program and you're going into senior year, it's kind of like, it's okay. Again, it can help because if the program's relevant, it's another item in your activities that's relevant to your admissions hook. I'm not saying to entirely not do it, but you have to understand where its place is in your resume, and it tends to be a lower to mid value at best in a lot of cases activity. It's not going to be the highest value, most impressive activity. So if you have other activities that sit adjacent to it that are higher value, and we'll get into some other categories, such as science research, more impressive science research, that would stand out much more than a summer program. So you have to understand what its utility is. In a lot of cases, to me, it has proxy value. It has value by virtue of it's helping to build some of your initial interest in the younger grades in a field. It's getting you some exposure. You're getting some skills that you'll need later on to further compound your resume. But for many students, if you're in a summer program and you're, again, going into 12th grade, again, it potentially is adding some value if it's relevant to your admissions hook and it's supporting the admissions hook. But it's in a lot of ways like taking Algebra 1 when you're going into 12th grade. It's just a lot of these summer programs just not returning you a ton of value, and I like to use them a lot more in an age-appropriate manner, which is students in the younger grades that are trying to put in more of those lower mid-value foundations of the resume, not at the point in 11th or 12th grade where you really need to ideally have built up your resume to now where you're getting higher value activities. In the same way that you build a resume in a career, you get the best, most elevated positions once you've stacked a whole bunch of earlier experiences and activities and skill sets. I like the summer programs. Again, if they're sitting adjacent to a bunch of other things that you're doing that have higher relative value, it can be okay. But thinking that that's going to be the super high value thing that's going to differentiate you is just not true for the vast majority of summer programs in the later grades. Earlier grades, it can be okay to lay the foundation. But again, for summer programs, you're going to be looking for relevance, any nicheness, any uniqueness. A social entrepreneurship program is going to be much better than just a very generic business or finance program. Again, if that's your hook, if that's something that you're very interested in, if you have some interest in social fields or social sciences or service, and then you like to combine that with entrepreneurship. Again, it's a very specific subdomain of business, right? So you can see why it gets to be quite a bit more niche and more unique. So aim for more niche, unique, ideally as much as you possibly can, and relevant programs, and ideally ones that have a little bit more active contributions, as we spoke about with the clubs, right? So it's a lot of these same factors keep reoccurring. It's depth, contributions. Is there a research project in that summer program? Is there some tangible output? Could you get a business idea that comes out of that where you go launch a business? And if that's the case, if you can have depth, if it's relevant, if it's niche and unique, then you're checking a lot of boxes there, and it will start to become a little bit higher value. So you have to, it's not just the overall category, it's also some of those other considerations. Overall, I think the category is vastly overrated, as I have mentioned earlier, but if you can check off some of those boxes, it's the difference, again, between just being a student who's a member of the school newspaper versus being a student who has an English-related hook or journalism hook for college. Now newspaper's relevant, you're the editor-in-chief, you have leadership, you have depth, you've been part of it since 9th grade, and then you've innovated and launched, several different columns, and you've really built it up. Well, that looks a lot different from just another kid who's a member of the newspaper from 11th grade who's positioning for medicine. It's, in that case, newspaper is extremely low value under that, given those contributions, that depth, that continuity, and the entire lack of relevance to their missions narrative. So same thing with summer programs. It depends on some of these other variables as well. How relevant, how much depth, is there a tangible output that you're getting out of it, etc. Research. So a lot of people conflate research with simply science research. So I've tried to make a distinction on this podcast as to, or just to clarify, that research is not just science research. Science research is a specific type of research. It might be the field or the broad umbrella that we most associate with research. And I think for a lot of people, research tends to evoke notions of, somebody in a lab with a microscope, doing a cancer study. And yes, there's a lot of biomedical research and natural science research, but research is not specific to those domains. And I think a lot of high schools in the United States that have science research programs, because many of them nowadays do, and this wasn't necessarily the case several decades ago, but this is becoming the case in a lot of ways because a lot of these high schools have seen the importance of some of this admissions narrative, some of the spike, and so they're offering certain opportunities or electives that give students earlier exposure to things like science research or business or entrepreneurship, etc. So there are many science research programs now at many high schools across the United States, and I think they've done students and many families a very significant disservice by labeling their programs science research. Now, at some schools, they'll have something else like a Cambridge program that might be a little bit more amenable. They'll have AP Seminar, or they'll have Global Scholars. They'll have some other class or some other program that's maybe has a research or independent, it could be independent study as well. That could be an elective. It's called independent study. Either through a class or a program, they will have something that's a little bit more leaning or branded a little bit more specifically towards social sciences or humanities research, or at the very least, just because it lacks the very specific title of science research, it at least kind of connotes that it's more open, right? It's more general, independent study on anything that you want, or research on anything that you want. And I think that that would probably be a little bit better. Even in the science research programs, I think they should ideally really change the name to just research programs and stop using the term science research. It's very important to note that even at some of these top competitions, such as Regeneron STS, Science Talent Search, was one of the preeminent science awards and competitions for students in senior year. There are many students who are Regeneron STS semifinalists, top 300 in the country, who are studying something that's in the social or behavioral sciences, for example, versus maybe in the more traditional hard sciences or something that's biomedical. So there is a great number of students. There are students who actually are doing business research or something related to a corporation. And they still go and compete in that competition. If you want my opinion, also understanding the psychology of admissions officer, most admissions officers, particularly at the top schools, do not come from a hard science background. They come from very often more social science backgrounds. They were history majors. They're more liberal arts training. There are very few top colleges that have faculty review, in which case you have you have an expert in a specific domain reading your application. And so I actually think it's a bit of a strategic advantage to students who have interest in some of the social behavioral sciences that can still do a research study, but maybe it's in business research, or maybe it's in, psychology or psychology applied to business, or something that maybe is what you would traditionally associate with, real science research. I think that can be more accessible to a lay admissions officer when they're reading your application or an abstract, or you're describing your research in your application, because they lack technical expertise. And a lot of students have these papers where you have they have no chance in the world of understanding what this paper is about, 0% chance, right? And the student also, because sometimes they just can't, like many people are so deep in their field, they can't, put themselves in somebody else's, shoes. Yeah, maybe they can write a lay abstract instead of the more technical abstract, but even so, a lot of it may be lost on an admissions officer anyway. There's that factor. Then there's also the factor that in some of these competitions, because so many students are doing very traditional science research, is the same way that I view students who apply to medical school. If you're a philosophy major applying to medical school, very interesting, because it's a very sideways positioning, and I'm kind of reading your application like, yeah, here's another biology major, here's another chemistry major, next. Here's a philosophy major. What the heck are they doing applying to medical school, right? Now you have to take your pre-med prerequisites, and you'll have to done some science research, etc., for your philosophy major, because you're coming from a very different background. But if you can make a compelling case why you want to go to medical school, you're going to stand out a lot more than somebody who's just another biology or chemistry major or biomedical engineer. So I think it's actually strategically advantageous to a lot of students to view research much more broadly, to do research in fields that many students are not possibly doing research in. I think it could help you in some of these competitions to stand out. I think it could be more accessible to an admissions officer reading your application. The humanities, social science, some of these other fields are not, as popular nowadays. It's now all about technology and STEM and business. And yeah, that's great, right? Everybody wants to go work for Facebook or Google, etc. But here's the problem. Everybody's now playing that game. So now it's super saturated, right? So, and now the market is really caught up with all the saturation, unfortunately. So now, yeah, maybe 15, 20 years ago, you're maybe on the cutting edge. Now you're hitting a massive saturation points. And now you're also hitting other possible issues such as artificial intelligence. So I think that a lot of students need to have a very broad view of research, understand research is something that's carried out in a lot of disciplines. And even if it's a little bit harder to get a research position, there are way more science research positions because there are way more people at universities and mentors conducting science research. And that's the type of opportunity that you would be trying to get. You'd be trying to reach out. And this is what you do in a science research program. In high school is they have you send emails, reach out emails. This is what we do with our students. You're reaching out to university mentors in a lot of cases who are performing science research at those universities and in their labs. And a lot of people, again, they don't understand how to reframe difficulty. It might be more difficult to get a position, a research position in a field that's not science because there's so many science research opportunities and professors, but look at it the other way because there aren't as many students who are conducting something that's not science research per se, but they're maybe doing something again like business research or English research or philosophy research or economics research or some other field, history research, political science research, policy research. They're doing something that's more off the grid. There might be, to some extent, fewer opportunities, but it's also going to stand out a lot more. There are many students. I don't think science research has hit its full saturation point, and there's still a lot of uniqueness because there's so many different studies and topics and investigations that there's just a much wider array of diversity than there is, for example, for high school clubs, right? There's very common clubs that just tend to pop up in every single high school, so they tend to be very common. However, research is so expansive. There's so many different topics and fields and subfields and substreams of investigation that there's so much natural heterogeneity in science research that I don't think it's very hard for it to hit a saturation point or for students to really be doing the exact same study or exact same research as another students. But from a broader umbrella, sort of way of looking at it, yes, there are a lot of students overall in science research. And if you're something that's not straight up science research or biomedical research or something that's very traditional, it can also help you to stand out. So I do want to encourage students to really think a lot more broadly about research and seriously consider conducting research in a field that maybe is not a traditional science field, particularly if your hook is not going to be science related, right? And I think this is a very significant mistake. We see this again and again in our advising program. Many people don't partake in the science research program simply because it has the word science appended to it. And I think that could be a mistake and a bit of a failure of imagination and a bit of a failure of just understanding how research works and how pervasive it is. So yes, there might be a little bit of more difficulty and some liabilities that are associated with that. They might not be as easy. But again, there's another side of that too, which is there are as many students that are reaching out to those professors if they're in a little bit less traditional fields doing research. So please try to take advantage and have a much broader view towards research. It could definitely differentiate. And in terms of the value of research, it is a very, it depends on what you do with it, just as with a club, right? Being a member of a club since 11th grade, very little continuity, no real active contributions. If it's not a relevant club to your admissions hook, very low value club, right? Same thing with research. It depends. Again, is it unique? Is it niche? Is it relevant to your admissions hook? Do you have depth of contributions? Are you actively doing stuff in the research? Are you playing a meaningful role? Are you engaged? Can you innovate a protocol? Are you going above and beyond? You don't need to have a publication that comes out of a research position, but of course that will be a tangible output that will help to augment or give the research capacity more depth. But it is, again, going to be a lot of those considerations, not just the overall category. It is factors such as relevance to the admissions hook, the uniqueness, the nicheness, and the depth of contribution and continuity in the activity. Number 4, internships. So internships, this is actually a category that I don't think we very often view this as a category in our advising program. I think internship is a very flexible term. I think that, for example, you consider a research position an internship. It's a matter of semantics, but in a lot of cases, we'll just say the student's a research assistant and not call it an internship. So I think there's a little bit of some semantic liabilities with an internship. It really can vary quite a bit. Does somebody choose to call this an internship, whereas we might more often call it a research assistantship, etc. I'm going to consider, of course, there could be internships across a very wide array of fields. You could be an intern at a magazine or for a publication. This will also overlap with some of these other categories because we do have publications and media as one of our other categories. So these categories aren't entirely, differentiated from each other. There is a lot of overlap. So internship, again, could, for instance, overlap with the preceding category of research if you wanted to call it a research internship. We generally tend not to. But internship could be in almost any domain. Again, you could be doing a policy-related or a government-related internship. You could be interning for a business. You could be interning at a law firm. So again, if it's going to be something that's very relevant to your passion and to your admissions hook, it's going to make it much more interesting. If you're doing a legal internship and you're positioning for engineering without any strategy as to how those two things are going to come together, if you can find a way for them to come together, like for instance, if you want to be a patent attorney, then there's obviously a very obvious connection between law and engineering, and that could be fascinating, right? So it's not even that. I think a lot of people just don't have the creativity of not thinking carefully enough of how two things that I have, or 2 or 3 activities, or 2 or 3 interests, or 3 or 4 interests, how I can find a way to make them relevant to each other, right? It doesn't have to just be, they have to obviously, on their surface be relevant. That's the easiest, of course, because it's obvious. If you're interested in business and you're in the business club, very obvious the relevance, but it doesn't always need to be just surface level. And this is where things like essays in the application can really be that connective glue where you can say, you can explain why you have 2 or 3 different fields, but how they all come together into one interdisciplinary sort of picture, or maybe that you want to study, because very often students are listing very often 2 or 3 majors in their application, not just a single major in their application. So it can be across a wide array of fields. Some landmines that I would look out for: please do not do an internship with your parents or with your parents' business or at your parents' firm if you're going to use it in your activities list or your college admissions. I've mentioned this in our application red flags to avoid episode. That will be perceived very negatively in a lot of cases, that you have an unfair advantage, particularly if it's a family member and it's a very traditionally white-collar, privilege-laden career. It's your dad's hedge fund, or it's something that's just not extremely likable. You have to understand the optics that are associated with college admissions. There are many students who don't come from that type of privilege. Their parents don't have those types of careers. They don't have access to those opportunities. And so it can come across as an unfair advantage. It can come across as disingenuous, that it's not the student's interests or their fields because it's the parents' fields, and maybe the parents are forcing it on the student. If you want to do it for your own recreation or your own intrinsic interest, that's totally fine, right? There's a difference between, again, front-facing towards an admissions officer and back-end, right? There are things that you can do. If you want to shadow a doctor in a hospital, not going to be impressive to an admissions officer, not remotely. Nobody's going to be impressed by you walking around a hospital following somebody around. The term shadow does not convey anything even remotely impressive. It is almost by its very nature, almost a condescending term, that you're a shadow. It's like something that doesn't even exist, right? That is something you don't want to convey to an admissions officer in your application. If you want to go shadow a doctor because you want to see if you're actually really interested in medicine, that's back end. There's a difference between back end and front ends, right? And you can choose what you present in terms of your activities. There's a lot more flexibility and plasticity in the activities than there is for something like your transcript, where you can't hide those grades. Your transcript is non-fungible. So in terms of the internships, be very careful about some optics. You can maybe do something that you got through a networking or family networking. Just be careful to not really signal it in the application where they can connect the dots. So in that case, it can maybe be included if you can work around some of the optics of it. In some cases, you might not want to go in the application at all, or it might not be relevant to anything you're selling the college on, in which case it just becomes confusing and starts to dilute the picture that they're trying to digest in 8 minutes. So just be careful of some of those optics with the internships. Also, if you have a business internship, but there's no undergraduate business program, you don't have a very strong business angle, it's a very competitive field, it might not be the best to include that or really highlight that in your application, because the thing it's doing is it's lumping you in with a lot of the business students, and I've talked about this a lot with medicine. If you did something like, a medical internship that had really no contributions, had no real depth, it's very common among many students, it almost becomes like a liability, the activity, instead of an asset. So just be careful. More unique, niche, relevant internships that don't have any particular connections or networking, or just things that are not very likable. Like, again, an internship at some top law firm, how did you get it, right? If you can explain that you got an internship as a high schooler at one of the top law firms, and the way that you did it was because you went to, down to New York, you went to New York City, or you traveled, or you drove 2 hours in a car, and you decided you were going to go into the law office building and ask every single person until you walked out of there with a legal internship as a high schooler. They told you can't do an internship here. You're 16 years old. That's very different, right? That narrative is much different from you just go put a law internship, and I can kind of see, well, your dad's, a JD from Harvard, and your mom is as well, and it looks very different. And so this is a lot of what I call the difference between baseline and plotline. Baseline is just the facts as they are. Plotline is the narrative that is built around it, the story that is created based on these implicit evaluations and assumptions in the social context. So just be careful about some of those optics. If you were the student who got an exceptional legal internship that you weren't supposed to have through your extraordinary industriousness, then that's very different. But you have to sort of understand that context and how it might be read. Number 5, initiatives and projects. So first off, I'll just mention that there's this notion in admissions and in advising of a passion project, and I utterly hate this term, passion project. I think it comes across as very fake. I think it comes across as very disingenuous. I would really caution students from using that term in their applications. It is a term that is thrown around by many college consultants and people who are in the admissions industry and the counseling industry, and I really dislike the term. The reason I dislike it is, again, because it can convey a bit of lack of sincerity. It can convey disingenuousness. It can come across as artificial, contrived, purely strategic, not something that you're actually, ironically, given that you call it a passion project, something that you're actually not really passionate about, but you're just doing for college admissions. So there's a lot of those connotations and unfortunate connotations. I also don't like the notion of a passion project because I think it implies that you're playing a finite game. It implies that you are playing a game that is, I'm going to do this little project and I'm going to put in my 25 hours on this project because it looked good for college admissions. And even as I'm saying it, it starts to remind me a lot of community service, right? I kind of put my, I punch in, punch out, I put in my hours of service. And I just really dislike this notion. I dislike this notion of there's a set amount of hours. People who are really passionate about something, they're not counting hours, right? And so this notion of you have to have 100 community service hours and the kid's keeping a record of, I'm at 86, I got to get to 100. Does that sound fun? Does that sound like you're super passionate and motivated if you're watching the clock all the time? No, it doesn't sound like that at all. So I don't like this notion of passion project because it seems very just finite. I have to do this thing and this project to maybe go to this college. And so we have come across, I remember a student a few months ago earlier in the summer, and she was using this term passion project. And it was there's nothing wrong with actually what you're doing. It actually was awesome. The project that she had conceptualized was excellent. It was super niche, it was relevant, it was really unique, it was different, it was well positioned, it was what she was really interested in, she was genuinely passionate about it, but she called it a passion project. I was please, everything else about it is great, which is obviously the most important part, the substance of what it actually is, but please don't call it a passion project, and please don't call it a passion project in your college applications. So I have a extreme aversion to the labeling of anything as a passion project. I think it tends to connote a gimmick. That rant aside, initiatives and projects category is a lot more miscellaneous. It's a lot more flexible. So these could be things like, for example, we've had a student, she might be listening to this episode, who created a solar-powered charging station. We've had students who maybe launched a bit of a study, maybe related to exercise or well-being or mental well-being or mental wellness at their high school. So that's kind of a bit more if it's not tied to any particular club, it's not tied to a formal organization the kid's running. It's kind of more of a one-off. You get some of these one-offs initiatives and projects. That would kind of go in this category. It's definitely something that's self-initiated, self-driven by the students. In a lot of cases, you can potentially have help if you have some other people that can do it with you as well. But it's a little more of a miscellaneous category. Again, it's probably maybe going to be a project or initiative that is maybe something at your school. Again, a wellness program, maybe a fitness study you want to sort of run. It's a little bit more of a one-off. Again, there's something in your community that your community can be school community, but it could also be your community outside of school, and you sort of just take this bit of initiative. It doesn't become anything like a major organization that would start to then overlap with some of these other categories that we have, such as a business or a nonprofit, etc. So those can also definitely be quite useful. I think some of the downsides are it's very unstructured, some of those initiatives and those projects. If you want to do, a study at your school or initiative at your school, again, it's sort of maybe launching a club. You might have some friction there. You have to get some approvals. It can definitely be done for sure, but you also have to know where you are, right? And there's a difference. Again, I don't think that it's helpful in many ways to define a student as being either a self-starter or not a self-starter, but to also understand that there's a ramp, right? And there's a progression, just like you take Algebra 1, then you take Algebra 2, Then you take, you progress up to calculus, then post-calculus. In some cases, it might be good to start with something that's a little bit more structured before you go launch the entire school club. But if you're that kid and you feel like you can pull it off, you can put in the initiative, then definitely go for it. Always go for the thing that, is going to be the most differentiating. But initiatives and projects, because it's a little bit less structured, and it might, as the category sounds, require a lot more freeform initiative. It's not something that's maybe, it's not something that you have to do, and it might have some liabilities if it has some lack of structure. And so kid has to really be very particularly organized, be able to organize a project, have very good social interpersonal skills to get it approved at a school or in the community, or send those reach out emails. You're going to need those skills regardless for a lot of these other categories. But again, not every single one of these things. Again, I hope nobody's interpreting it this way. I'm giving you 10 different ways to build an admissions hook. You don't need to take advantage of all 10 of these. You can get a lot of mileage, even, as I said, with clubs. You could have 3 clubs, for example, one of which you founded, 2 of which are relevant to your missions narrative, and you've made substantial contributions. And, you have multiple even just in that category. So, that is one category of issues and projects. There's some liabilities in terms of maybe lack of structure. And again, the same considerations. Is it relevant to your admissions hook or your strengths or unique passions? How deep are you going into it? And, is it unique, a little bit more niche, or is it, you're creating some very, very, very common community service initiative project that a million other kids would have something very, very, very similar. And again, that uniqueness will come by trying to really think very cleverly about, if I'm passionate about 2 or 3 things, can I find an intersection of these 2 fields? I think a lot of people just don't have enough exposure to many different academic disciplines to understand what a lot of these fields are that intersect multiple fields. And if that's the case, go do a Google search. Just go do a Google search. How is engineering related to law? How is business related to psychology? What are people called who study the application of psychology to business? You now have, you'll get an AI response. You can ask ChatGPT, what's an interesting way? It's actually a really good use case for ChatGPT, besides cheating. Who is somebody, or what's the name of somebody who studies the intersection of biology plus this other thing plus this other thing, right? And you'll probably get exposure to a new field that you might not even have known existed. So that's also how you can create some uniqueness or nicheness, is by identifying maybe a couple passions and finding some of the intersections and people who sit up at that intersection. And then that's how you could bring you that uniqueness or that niche to an initiative or a project, possibly. Number 6, organizations. So initiatives and projects, I meant a little bit more one-offs. You could do a few one-offs. So if you want to do a few different sustainability initiatives, you can do a few different projects around your school. But the difference between an initiative and a project, at least as I'm defining it, is more one, and an organization is more than an organization would be like a real structure and a system around it. So if you did a one-off school workshop, and we had, for example, a student who I think taught graphic design skills, sort of related to marketing, taught that to younger students, right? So it was related to their hook, but they kind of brought in, sort of a service capacity in a workshop, one-off initiative or project. There's doing a workshop, which would be an initiative or a project, more of a one-off, or maybe there's a few of them, but they're more sort of ad hoc or isolated, versus a full organization, right? So there's a difference between having one lemonade stand and having a full business. There's a difference between having done one workshop and then having a workshop program or organization that does workshops. So this is more of what I mean by organizations, like student-driven organizations. Now, very similar to the passion project, I really increasingly have grown to dislike the term nonprofit, or 501c3, I believe is the legal designation. I don't like it, probably for some of the reasons that might be fairly obvious. I think a lot of people in admissions increasingly, a lot of people outside of admissions, I think increasingly view it as a gimmick or purely a strategic artifice. And there's just no real upside to having to turn an organization that a student runs into a nonprofit. I think, again, there's a lot of things There are different strategic life cycles, and just as at one point in the history of admissions, playing a sport and violin and being the president of your class was actually unique. When you were in the avant-garde, you were in the pioneers and among the first people to do that. There was actually a time when that was unique. Unfortunately, it hit a saturation point where it no longer became unique, and a lot of things they'll just run out, right? They'll run through their life cycle. It's the same thing as I said with computer science. If you were interested in computer science in the mid-1990s, obviously there's a very long-running history of computer science, but in terms of its situation in academia and a lot more formal programs, academia tends to be quite slow to catch up with a lot of things in industry and private sector and commerce. Yes, if you were interested in computer science in 1997, very different from a student now being interested in computer science in 2024. It's the same thing as like if you bought Amazon stock in 1997 versus now, right? It's just there are some things that were underpriced, but now they're very overpriced and very crowded and have become extremely commoditized, and people have basically driven them into the ground. So nonprofit is one of those things that I think if you want to start an organization, I don't think there's really any significant advantage. They're not looking for, the legitimacy. It's not that hard to create a nonprofit or file for a nonprofit, but I don't think it's really work that's really necessary to go through. I think it's time that's mostly wasted time. And again, just I think giving it the nonprofit name, I think can hit some just negative connotations. So I'm not a big fan. I think you could do what a nonprofit is in essence without attaching the label, in the same way that I said that earlier student was referring to something that was an initiative or project, but called it a passion project. I'm kind of trying to differentiate the label because boards are meaningful, and how you label these things in the application and how you brand them to admissions officers, it matters, right? But that's different from the substance, and you have a lot of flexibility in terms of how you can label something. So I think having something that maybe has the spirit of a nonprofit, but you're not necessarily calling a nonprofit, I think that can be fun. Of course, there are things such as businesses. This is, again, just as with initiatives and projects, a student has to really audit their strengths and their capacities and their support. Are they capable? Do they have the skills of launching a business? Are they the student who's a real self-starter who can exist with a lack of structure? Those are very important considerations. And so students who are very highly organized, I ask many students, do you have a planner? Do you use a calendar? Obviously, if they're working with us, or if they have help, then I'm not as worried about it, right? Because I know we can provide structure. If a parent were able to provide structure, they have other resources. If they're working with a friend who's super meticulous and great at creating spreadsheets, and well, then that's different, right? So it can also be external to the students as well. And even if you are running a business in the same way that most businesses operate, and what I said earlier in the podcast is you don't necessarily have to be everything to the business, right? If you have 5 people you want to run a business with and you have different unique skill sets, that's totally fine too. And you could put people around you who have complementary skill sets. So that's also fine. So it's not totally beholden to, is the student great at everything and they're the most organized and they're the person who would be like the most anal about accounting and the financials. And then that's, if you have the ability to delegate that or find that structure or some of those skill sets external to you, then that could be fine. You can sort of make up for some of your deficits in that case. However, if you're going to go it alone, then you do need to have a lot of self-awareness and audit who you are and what your strengths are. Can you build them up? In terms of the skills for business, understanding things like marketing and financial aspects, and that's where having other building blocks are going to be important, right? So that's where looking YouTube videos up, taking a Coursera course online about business, possibly a summer program. I just don't think it's necessary to take a full rigid summer program that you have to pay for, that has like an application, a very concrete, like you can get this information for free, right? So if you just go on YouTube, if you take one of these Coursera classes that are online, there's a whole bunch of free university classes that are offered online. If your school has business electives, you already have access to all this information, this knowledge. And this is why I don't have a lot of sympathy for people who say they want to do business when they have the entire world at their fingertips and have done nothing, literally nothing, to show me that they're interested in business. Have not looked up a single YouTube video, have done nothing. And I think this is very different from when parents went to college and they weren't in the internet age, right? Students nowadays have the entire world in the palm of their hand if they have an iPhone. They can look anything up, take any course, watch any YouTube video. You have access to people who are at the tops of their fields. You have master classes. Nobody in human history has ever had access to this type of information, certainly not for free, until very recently. So to not be taking advantage of it, to say that you can't start a business because you don't know how or you don't have the information, it's an excuse. And trust me, there's somebody else who's taking advantage of all those unique opportunities that are afforded to them in the age that we live in the internet era. So they are trying to find a mentor. They're sending reach outs to people who study business or conduct business. They're watching the YouTube videos. They're taking the courses. Certainly if their school has business electives, they're taking advantage of them. And if you're not, then you need to be very honest with yourself as to if you're really that interested in it. So in terms of those businesses, again, it's going to be a lot of those considerations. Do you have the skill set yet? Are you trying to build that skill set? Maybe the business isn't something you should start now because you need to build some of those skills. On the other hand, you don't want to be the person who just tries to learn forever from a textbook or from courses, and you're the person who reads books forever, but doesn't actually do anything, right? So you also have to do things to learn and to iterate, right? So there's some point there, some equilibrium where take the YouTube classes, take the Coursera classes, take the university class, reach out, try to find a mentor if you don't, but at some point you got to do something, right? So, and this is going to, again, depends by age, right? If a student's in 7th grade, 6th grade, 8th grade, 9th grade, maybe it's more foundational skill building time because they're going to be totally thrown in the deep end if they were to try to start a business by themselves. So it's a bit of those hard skills combined with, again, those soft skills, those organizational skills, those executive functioning skills. And if you lack something, either a hard skill or a soft skill, you should also be thinking, can I find it somewhere else? Can I find a friend? Can somebody else help me? Okay, number 7, media. So media is a very broad category. I do want to just differentiate. There are things like publications where a student might get a publication in a magazine or an online publication. There are teen publications that are very amenable to teens being published. Obviously much different to get published in a major publication that, you have very, professional authors submitting to, something that's very difficult. But there are publications that do exist mostly for teenagers. There's things such as Teen Ink. And again, there's always going to be a trade-off, right? If you got something published in the New York Times, of course, it has a much higher payoff, but it's more difficult. So it's always taking a multifaceted strategy. In some cases, it's starting. Can you get one publication in something? Then maybe could you build up? Resumes are, again, very cumulative and compounding. You should not expect to get the absolute highest value, super rare opportunity, a major grant for your organization when you're in 8th grade and you're at the bottom of the mountain of building your skill set and your resume in a particular field, right? This doesn't make sense. Nobody applies directly for the CFO position at like a major organization, right? So you have to understand that there's a bit of a way of working yourself up. Does that mean totally don't go for it? Again, if you have the opportunity to start a club at your high school and you feel like it's feasible, definitely go for it. And then also take advantage of some of the assistant clubs that might be a little bit of the low-hanging fruit. So you can always be doing both, right? You can be taking multifaceted approaches. But again, there are a lot of publications you can work your way up that are a little bit more teenage-friendly that you can consider. Of course, again, we want to consider relevance. So if you're in a science field, you want to be looking maybe at science publications. That would fall a little bit more under the science research category or the research category, because a lot of times those research publications come through or flow through the mentor. At the university, they're going to be the person who's submitting for publication. But in some cases, a student can submit if it's a lower tier journal. It's not one of the higher tier upper echelon peer reviewed journals that tend to be submitted to more by, actual university faculty, in many cases, PhDs. So you consider science domains, but a whole wide array of domains. There are history, publications. Obviously, there's just traditional literature and writing. You just want it to be relevant. If your narrative's history, then you might want to write a history paper. and see if you can get it published somewhere, or if it's a more generic forum, that just publishes anything across a variety of fields, you can certainly consider that as well. Of course, you need to, again, audit and be self-aware. Are you a strong writer? Do you enjoy writing? Not that you should just be beholden to whether you enjoy it. Like, obviously, if it's something good and, you really like history and you could write something about it, and it's just a good way of, putting something concrete in your resume, then still try to take advantage of it if you possibly can. But of course, you want to audit your strengths. You don't have to do all 10 of these different things or activity types. So if that's not your first and foremost area of expertise or area of interest, then, you're more the clubs and the research and the internships, then, you can lean a little bit more in some of those directions. But media, very common, particularly publications across a wide variety of fields that will map onto the wide variety of possible hooks that students will have or their unique interests. There are also things such as podcasts. I did this on one of our recent admissions master classes, where I actually literally just did a podcast search for what the student's hook was in the master class, and you found a whole bunch of podcasts that were on that topic, and the student could just simply send a reach out to the podcast and say, hey, can I do some research for this podcast? Can I, or it could be research for a media publication, a magazine that's related to student's hook, and, they could flex it into an internship, etc. Okay, number 8, external coursework. So external coursework is, as it sounds, coursework that is external to a student's high school. The reason that can be positive, and again, I'll give some of the pros and cons in some of these cases. The pro of that is the students going above and beyond to further take coursework beyond the coursework that's afforded to them at their high school and in their immediate academic environment. So it definitely shows some initiative and some industriousness. They also, to show a practical level, might not have exposure to certain classes or electives that are related to their admissions hook. So something like cognitive science is not going to be a class I've never come across a single high school that has a cognitive science class. And I would probably put pretty good money that there might not be a single high school in the United States that has a class in cognitive science. However, there are some, particularly private schools or very large public schools, that have very large, diverse, rich course catalogs, and there might be one or a handful. But if you also, again, I'm kind of encouraging to have a niche or an intersection in your hook, but that also, again, starts to eliminate, you just won't have as many options to study that thing if it's very niche at your high school in a lot of cases, right? So, and it will depend by the high school and how rich the diversity of offerings and electives are. So, external coursework, it might be a practical element of, like, you just can't pursue that field or study it a little bit more in an academic context because it's not afforded to you at your high school. Second, maybe you want to just go above and beyond. There are students who just saturate or run through the math curriculum at their high school, and then they're basically forced to go take a college class or a community college class. So that's what we mean by external coursework. Obviously, there are some pros there. It shows industrious initiative. It can further support the hook. The trade-offs, there's a trade-off to any of these, which is there's always an opportunity cost. You can't do absolutely everything. And so that's why I say it's sort of being self-aware. What are your strengths? What are you most passionate about in terms of some of these vehicles and these activities? There's always a baked-in cost or a con in some way to any activity. Being just, if there's an opportunity cost, if you do that, you might not have enough time to do one of the other ones, right? And so you have to sort of pick your battles wisely. So of course, there's a trade-off in terms of time. Sometimes these college classes run during the year when the student's in high school, so you wouldn't want it to hurt your grades. That would be a very poor trade-off. If you taking, 3 extra college courses ends up with you getting, a couple of B pluses on your transcript where you're otherwise, on your high school transcript, where you're otherwise a straight A student, that would be a very bad move. And also understanding that external coursework and college courses are very fungible. You could hide those transcripts if you needed to. You have no choice but to send your high school transcript to the college, right? So you have to understand there's a difference between something that you can actually hide from admissions office. You can hide an activity in your activities list or in your resume. You can't hide your academic or your high school transcript. As I said, it's non-fungible, right? NFT, and if you may think that means non-fungible token, I believe it is, but there's also another interpretation of that, which is non-fungible transcript, which you can't change your academic transcript, so you have to keep that in mind as well. So external coursework, it can be lighter courses that are informal, like Coursera courses, edX, things that are online, and those could further help to support your hook. But also just by proxy, again, they might be giving you the skills that you need for something else. So if you want to go run a business in that organizations column, you might need some business skills and you might need to go take that Coursera class, right? You might see marketing skills because you have a marketing hook, or you need marketing for your business, right? You might need some coding skills, right? And you can't wait, or you don't want to wait until you can take, AP computer science in junior year at your high school. Like, you don't have the luxury of that time. It's very late, right? To be waiting to build some of those in the foundation of that skill set. And many students learn coding informally. So I think the external coursework can also serve some of that proxy value or that indirect value of also giving you the skills. You're taking classes that are giving you the skills to help you, create more leverage and build in some of these other categories, such as businesses or something that's maybe based on coding. So that can also be very helpful in that way. Again, the big con is it is fairly structured. Like a lot of external coursework, especially if you're taking a college class, like will have a lot of structure to it with the teacher. If it's self-paced or it's online, it's going to require a little bit more of you having a plan and being organized, and being the type of student that can set a planner and dates and, just be on top of that. There is this notion, I think, of a lot of students who try to really load up their metrics, which is they try to go take a ton of college classes. They self-study for a ton of APs, which we'll talk about in another episode. Like, they go all out on loading up the metrics being things like courses, course rigor, grades, test scores. And they think by being the kid who has 19 APs and sticking 6 college classes, yes, it's impressive, but there also comes a point where there's diminishing returns. And I think there are a lot of students who don't understand at some point there are diminishing returns that are paid to you. And there are many students who build such a metrics-based profile. They're just the kid who self-studies for 1 million AP exams, or, they're just all metrics. There's all quantitative factors. And the college then looks at that student and they don't really have the exceptional intellectual vitality or curiosity. They don't have that really niche, research position or that niche activity or that niche club. And so there are liabilities with just going really too far down this route of students who are taking a ton of college classes, like just metrics. And I do worry for some of those kids that, again, it starts to hit a point of diminishing returns, and they then become the kid who becomes the sort of like almost like academic machine robot that a lot of colleges also don't want at some level. So, okay, number 9, competitions and awards. So I think this is a little bit similar, and I think there are some cons, but obviously there are a lot of pros as well. So if you can compete in some way, if there are some academic competitions that are related to your hook, again, it's relevance. It's all about relevance. It's going to be relevant to your hook. If you're a student who's much later on, then you're playing a different game, right? If you're looking at your whole high school career, and you have multiple years, well, then you could take a much more strategic perspective, right? You can lay out the strategy and then do these things in line with the strategy. Like, I'm identifying my hook, and then I'm going to sort of pursue things along these lines. If you're much later on, or you have a much older student who's an application process, you have to do it in kind of the opposite direction. You have to look at all the evidence and say, well, I did this club on this theme, and I did this summer program on this theme, and then I did this initiative project, and you have to find a way now to like come up with a narrative in a very creative way. It might have to be very creative if they're very disparate on their surface, these different themes or activities. So it really depends on where you're at in the process. Some students can start with strategy and then move into the actions and the tactics and do it that way. That tends to be a bit ideal, though you have less data that you're working with. Then there are older students who have a lot of data. It's just very messy data, and now you need to find a way to tell that story in a very unique and compelling way and make sense out of it, now having the vast majority of the data in the clubs, and I did this, and I did this, and I did this, right? So it's kind of a bit of both top-down and sort of bottom-up, depending on where you are in your high school career. So in terms of competitions, again, if it can be academically relevant, if you know your hook, and you know what your passions are, obviously try to aim for, competitions that are relevant to that will support and, buttress that narrative. If you have awards that are in your field, certainly there's a vast array of awards. There are school awards, there are regional awards, there are national awards, international awards. Of course, the more rare and scarce you are, the higher level the award. If it's an Olympiad, if it's something really national, international, of course, that's always going to be better. If it's something that's only given out to one kid in the whole country, of course, that's going to be the most ideal, but it's definitely not necessary. It's just, of course, there are going to be different degrees of impressiveness and scarcity and, distinction among students. Of course, you're going to want, again, as long as you have relevant awards, that will serve it definitely will be helpful, even if they're regional awards or school-based awards. As I mentioned in the last podcast, there are many schools that have a wide slate of awards. It depends, in terms of which high school you attend, but they have book awards, they have awards for different subjects. Of course, if you're the kid who has a history hook and your school gives a social studies award or history award, well, yeah, that'd be a good award. It's pretty relevant to your admissions narrative. It's nice to have in there. It's further when the admissions office is reading your application, it's how often they keep seeing the same type of content that reinforces the narrative in the admission story so that they get it very fast in those 8 or 10 minutes that they're reading your application. So awards and competitions they're not an absolute necessity. There are students who do get into even highly selective schools. Their high school maybe just doesn't have any awards. They didn't apply. It is not an absolute necessity, but it is certainly nice to have. And again, it will depend on how high your goals are. Certainly, if you're aiming for top 25, would like to have them. You would like to have some relevant awards if you can. There's going to be limitations based on your high school context, of course, right? If your high school gives out those awards, if they don't. You'd like to have them for highly selective schools. It's certainly preferable versus not. And then it will also depend, are you aiming for top 25 versus top 15 versus top 10 versus top 5? And I've talked about that a lot on this podcast. A top 5 school like Harvard, Stanford, Yale, Princeton, MIT is very, very different in terms of difficulty of gaining admission versus even a top 25 school, and even in a lot of cases top 10 schools. There could be a massive 3, 4, 5, 6x difference even among those top 25 schools in terms of difficulty of gaining admission and strength of the applicant pool. So if you're a kid who's aiming for a top 5 school, like a Harvard, Stanford, Yale, etc., MIT particularly, because there are a lot of STEM awards, particularly when there are a lot of kids who are applying to MIT who have a lot of STEM awards and competitions. You have to really know also what your goals are. It's going to be more important the more selective the institution, even among the most selective top 25 or so institutions. So we discussed the importance of some of the relevance. If there's a very niche award that you can win, again, it's going to be more rare. But if there's an opportunity to win an award in some very niche field that perfectly maps onto your very niche interest or passion that you devise, it's going to be, of course, a lot better. The more generic the award, so I've mentioned in the prior episode, unfortunately, National Honor Society not distinguishing. A lot of honor rolls, unfortunately, not going to do anything. It's not conveying any new information. I already have your transcript, so I don't really need to mean the honor roll doesn't mean anything. So there are awards that are just very common, don't stand out, like National Honor Society, as I said. They don't convey any new information. They're not relevant to your missions hook. There's just degrees to this. The other thing that I want to say related to competitions, they're going to be more prevalent in certain fields. I would say it's better if you can win awards and competitions and you're a little bit less of a field that really leans heavily into that. So if you can win a history award, history prize, writing, this is great because those fields are a little bit more underrepresented or they're undersubscribed majors in the first place. STEM is you'll have a lot more opportunities for competitions and awards, but again, there's always a flip side, which is by the same token, there are also so many of them that are so many students who have STEM competitions and awards. And if you're applying to a more technical leaning college like an MIT, a Carnegie Mellon, or even just a more technical wing of a school like the engineering program, if you're applying to Pratt at Duke, for example, you have to understand it's even, I would say, for students who have very strong STEM or technology interest or computer science, the awards and the competitions, you have to understand a lot of kids will have them in those fields because it's quite saturated and they're very common. Robotics club, robotics competitions, coding competitions. So I would say for students who are going to be in one of those very hot fields, it does move a little bit more to a competitive disadvantage, I would say. It's not something that's going to really differentiate you unless it's at a massive level in a STEM field. Again, particularly at the most selective institutions. But it almost becomes a bit of a competitive necessity versus even a competitive advantage. I think if you're in a very popular STEM-related field, technology-related field, coding, computer science, and this is why, as I laid out the strategic considerations for building an admissions hook in the earlier episode, you need to think about what field you're in and what does the competition look like. No pun intended there, but what's the competition look like in terms of the students in that field and what do they tend to have in terms of accolades and awards and competitions, etc. And because STEM and engineering is so saturated, computer science so saturated, there are many kids that if you're positioning in that way, they will have those types of awards. So you need to be aware of that. In terms of some other factors with the competitions and awards, it is very common, and there are just certain stereotypes. There are certain representations demographically, racially, ethnically, by sex or gender in terms of different fields. I think everybody understands that females are going to tend to be a little bit more underrepresented if it's something like engineering or mathematical or physical sciences. There are certain fields in which males are more underrepresented, such as psychology. So there are important considerations for these different fields and even some of these activity types. There are, if you are a student and you're interested in STEM, or as I said, CS, engineering, something technology related, there are a lot of students who have competitions and awards. You need to be aware of that in those fields who are positioning in that way. If you also come from a background that is very overrepresented, racially, ethnically, by your sex or your gender. So if you're an Indian American male who's interested in computer science, you need to understand at some level these awards. It's also math, right? There's Asian Americans very overrepresented in STEM fields, technology fields, pre-professional fields. You need to understand a bit of those optics, and this is it's taken into account, right? It might not be the most politically correct, but this is how admissions works. We know that there's a lot of quick profiling when they're reading your application. Human beings are human beings. These admissions officers are not robots reading your application. They are human beings. They're very subject to stereotyping, as any other human being is. They're making very fast judgments. And there is a lot of stereotyping and profiling and looking at your context. And so I would say if you are a student particularly, you have to understand there are some things that Asian and Indian students tend to do disproportionately compared to students from other backgrounds. And I've spent a lot of time talking about this in our admissions master classes, some of our newsletters. But you do have to understand that really being the Asian or Indian student who's interested in STEM or technology or computer science, and you do all the competitions and the awards, it's probably a competitive necessity because there are so many people in those fields that will have those things that you would be at a disadvantage if you don't in a lot of cases. However, I think believing that because you're an Asian or Indian student who's really interested in STEM or computer science or a lot of these very common fields that you're very overrepresented in it, particularly if you're a male and you're very overrepresented, thinking that you're one of the only kids that has these robotics competitions or these aquabots or, math competitions, it's not very differentiating. And you start to lean into a lot of stereotypes of being just another Asian kid who's good at math, who's on the math team and does the math competition. So I would not dissuade students if they're passionate and they're skilled. I would not dissuade them from partaking in those types of activities. But it's the same thing that I just said with the external coursework or being the kid who takes 19 APs, you're trying to get all the college courses. Like, you're fitting into very stereotypical categories of just the quantitative kid, and you're fitting very traditional stereotypes of you're more robotic and maybe you don't have the excellent interpersonal skills, or that you have to shore up some of the weaknesses and the liability. You don't want to be just the math competition kid, just the robotics kid. You want to not make yourself a commodity. And I've discussed this even in geographic context. There are a lot of kids in Silicon Valley. There might be some kids listening in Silicon Valley or parents listening in Silicon Valley where I think it's just so many kids interested in computer science, engineering, and technology. It makes total sense. That's what we all associate Silicon Valley with. But hey, guess what? That's also what admissions officers associate Silicon Valley with. It's what any human being associates Silicon Valley with. Who knows what Silicon Valley is? And so it's just not unexpected. It's not interesting. It's not that unique. It's not that unpredictable. I'm not like, oh my God, there's this kid from Silicon Valley who wants to go to Stanford and study computer science and does coding competitions, who's Asian male. Like, it's not that differentiating, right? And you need to understand this if we're being honest. If we're being honest, maybe not 100% politically correct, but if we're being realists about the admissions process and how human beings operate and how they think and how they work, you need to take it into account. So I'm not saying don't do it, but if you're the kid who is robotics competition and you have some other interesting things that are a little bit more off the grid, and I'll give you an example. We had a student, Indian American male, interested in aerospace engineering. Obviously, Indian American male, very overrepresented in engineering, but he also loved history. So we found very clever ways of connecting his history interests to aerospace engineering with Spitfire planes. And we put that in his recommendation, how he was studying. He did a project in his history class that was related to aerospace engineering. And he was interested in space policy, was the intersection of aerospace engineering with obviously, political science, international relations. And you can take other interests that you have that might be a little bit less stereotypical, right? The kid who's a history major, nobody associates being a history major, have a history interest with Silicon Valley, right? Like it's not like anybody views Silicon Valley as the hotbed of history majors, right? I'm just telling you, and nobody has to listen to what I'm saying, but I'm just telling you and I'm just giving you a warning. If you commoditize yourself, if you become just another or you fit into the stereotypes, and this is some of the liabilities with the competitions in the awards, particularly in STEM fields, if you're very racially, ethnically overrepresented, and particularly for males, telling you can play that game, but it's very expected, it's very predictable. They see a lot of it, particularly at these highly selective schools, and particularly at the most selective schools. Stanford has no shortage of kids who are the best in the world in these fields, these STEM fields. So you have to understand it will pay you diminishing returns at some point. Really pay attention to what are some of your other really unique hobbies or interests, and how can you maybe connect them so that you have some sideways positioning away from just some of these stereotypes. And the reason I'm mentioning is I believe strongly in not trying to just commoditize yourself or just not be just another kid who doesn't stand out in the admissions process. So it's a little bit, I think that there are many people who think because they're so good or they have these competitions and these awards, they think that, oh, I'm national level at this, I'm going to get into Stanford. And I've done case studies on this. It was in one of our newsletters, been multiple master classes where I've gone through a kid who was at national level in terms of these awards and competitions in these STEM fields and straight up rejected. So you still have liabilities and a target on your back, even if you are excellent in these fields, and you need to find other ways to make yourself a bit unique and connect other unique passions besides just what might be a bit stereotypical, and also just what's not that unexpected, right? If you're applying for engineering and you're selling them on your robotics club, yes, it's relevant, but it's definitely not unique. Like, you're going to get a million other kids who are writing their essays about robotics club or talking about robotics club in their interviews. So it's relevant, but it doesn't hit some of the other criteria that I've laid out, which is uniqueness and nicheness and not conforming to some particular stereotypes or even just associations. That just, of course, I'm going to expect an engineering kid to be part of the robotics club. It's just not unexpected. So, and anything that's expected just fits into the mold, and it doesn't make me take particular notice when I'm reading your application. So those are some of the liabilities with competitions awards, particularly for kids in STEM fields, particularly for kids who also come from who might be males, and even more so particularly from particular racial ethnic backgrounds. I think you need to be very well aware if we're being realistic about how admissions actually works. Number 10, service. So service is our very last category and activity here, and probably for a reason. So I know service is very common. A lot of people think you have to do service. They're looking for students who care for others. And, I think the reason why I really don't like this category, even as bad as it might sound, is because it's become an artifice, unfortunately. I think people have beaten it into the ground. I think there are too many kids writing their college essays with all this virtue signaling or conspicuous compassion, as I call it. This is the fancier sociological term that I mention a lot. That kids have trouble pronouncing in some cases. We'll just call it virtue signaling. But there are so many essays where kids are just writing about their community service and these very cliche themes. And it's because they think that that's what admissions officers want them to say, and they don't know any better. And I think that's one of the liabilities of service. One of the other issues that I have with service or community service is I don't view it as really a unique category. I'm putting it in here because I think some people might be like, oh, you didn't mention service. It's one of the most common things that people say you should do for your resume. But I don't view it as what would be referred to as a sui generis domain or field, which from Latin means it's something that's unique or it's irreducible. It's on its own terms, right? Service to me can be in any of these other categories. It's not really a unique category. So I don't even like considering it a category. I think you can be part of service clubs, or you can have a service contribution club. I think there are summer programs. If you're doing social entrepreneurship, that's related to service. Research can be service. Albert Einstein, I don't know if he ever worked in a soup kitchen or did the midnight run, but I'm pretty sure he contributed a massive amount of service and massive amount of contribution of value to humanity and to other people by his knowledge contributions and his knowledge work. So I don't like this notion that service can only be by virtue of giving your manpower hours or your hands in a soup kitchen or on a midnight run or for a charity, and the very obvious vehicles that we tend to associate it. I think that a student can be providing very significant service if they are making intellectual contributions to the world and research contributions to the world. So I really have never said to any students, and it's really not even a part of our program in any formal capacity, this notion that I think is jammed down so many different students' throats by many admissions counselors, guidance counselors, even high schools that have, very formal community service hour requirements. The colleges themselves, I think, will say this a lot in service. And again, you have to understand there's a lot of political correctness, there's a lot of sugarcoating admissions, a lot of what's the right thing to say. I think there are many, 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 many kids who gain admission who don't have any traditional and even bordering on cliche form of community service. And I don't think that means that they're not being a good person, or they're not a good person, or they haven't found a way to give back. But I think you can make contributions in other ways that are intellectual. If you run a business, nobody's paying you unless you're generating value. So by definition, you don't have a business unless you are generating value for other people. So I take a bit of maybe an unorthodox or a more controversial stance on this, because I think it doesn't make a lot of sense to tell a kid they have to go to the soup kitchen, they have to do these very generic things to the detriment of other things that are very unique to who they are. They have unique strengths. They are a kid who's very skilled in business. They're very skilled in coding. They, are a student who's, very skilled at making contributions in research. To say that kid is not performing any service capacity is ridiculous. So I disagree with this very traditional notion and these very traditional means or tactics or mechanisms for performing service. I think they're very ununique. I think they tend to look very contrived. I think they set the students up for a lot of unpalatable, distasteful virtue signaling in their applications that then further blends their applications with everybody else. I think it's been jammed down a lot of kids' throats that they have to do these things. And I think it's very important for students to understand that if you are auditing what you are uniquely passionate about and what you're uniquely good at, you will be giving the world value by virtue of that audit. If you find out what those things are, those are your highest leverage points for giving back to the world. So, and you are creating value if you're running a business, if you're coding for somebody else, organization. If you're coding for somebody If you're just coding, I mean, if you just have a website, if you just a blog and it's for yourself, there's somebody who's interested in it. You're giving some value. And so even in the media category, which we didn't get into, there are a lot of kids who just started YouTube. I didn't get into this YouTube or starting Instagram or a blog. And don't just do it because it's very hard to keep up, right? It's very hard to do the upkeep of, and now you have an archive of this, right? If you're the kid who's like, I'm going to go start a blog for college admissions. If you're not really passionate about it, you're going to do 2 entries and then you're going to stop doing it. And now you've created an internet history of the kid who's like showing they're not that passionate about it. It's terrible. It's very important to audit those passions. But if you're the kid and a lot of kids just start a YouTube channel because they're just interested in whatever it is. Even on the initiatives or the projects, I did mention a kid who was doing shipwreck diving because they were interested in history. And that was totally self-driven, but extremely interesting to be doing diving for shipwrecks and it related to his history theme. That really conveys intellectual curiosity and vitality and passion when nobody's looking and saying, you have to be a good person, you have to do this service activity, you have to meet this requirement. And that's a lot of my issue with the service. And I think the kid who goes and starts the YouTube channel or starts the Instagram and something that they really care about, and it's not necessarily for anybody else, just as I've said to a whole bunch of people, this podcast in a lot of ways, sure, there's a lot of, I do want to put out great information. I think there's a scarcity of information. There's a scarcity of honest information and information that doesn't have a lot of sugarcoating around it and political correctness. And I want to get that out there to a whole bunch of people. But I've also said to many people that the reason I do this podcast and they're long episodes and they're niche and I talk about these weird academic concepts that nobody's like, it's for me in a lot of cases. And so I won't bend to the content that I think is the most politically correct or the audience wants this content. I won't, because the podcast is for me in a lot of ways. It's not just for other people. And by making it for me, there's a non-trivial number of people who are like me who will really like the content. And I think it's the same thing if you're a student and you want to start a YouTube channel. View that as a form of service and possibly your highest leverage form of service, because you being the most passionate and being able to do it with nobody looking at you or for no one, for yourself, will end up being extremely valuable to a whole bunch of other people who are just interested in just you or your blog or your vlog or whatever you have to say or whatever you're passionate about. If you're not passionate about it, there's going to be a whole bunch of people who are just not that interested, unfortunately. So I don't love this service category for a lot of those reasons. And I don't believe it's really its own category. I believe it follows on the back of a lot of these other categories. And I fundamentally disagree that a kid who runs a business is not performing a service capacity, even if it's a for-profit business. Like, the business does not exist unless it's generating value for humanity. There would be nothing. There'd be no revenue. So sure, can you have a business that use those proceeds and that revenue to donate to charities? Of course, right? And to hit a social entrepreneurship. Of course. Is that a bit more obvious, some of the service? Of course. But I think it's very important that we view service in a lot of cases as following on the backs of a lot of these activities and viewing them as really capable of even just having, if a student, again, a student who does a marketing workshop, well, their hook is related to marketing. You can take that and you could turn it into an initiative or a project. But I think the very traditional forms of service that are very generic, very cliche. They don't speak to what students' very unique value proposition is to the world, that connects to what their unique passions are and their unique strengths. Okay. 2 more categories that I'll just mention very quickly. This is now our longest podcast episode at almost 2 hours, but I obviously have a lot to say. So 2 categories that I have not included is for anybody who's wondering why these are omitted, given that they are 2 of the most common categories that people talk about and have in their resume: sports and music / instruments. So sports is not included because, again, this podcast focuses on highly selective institutions. Unless you are a recruited athlete or you are excellent at a sport, it unfortunately, and again, I know this is harsh for many people to hear, I love sports at a personal level, but when it comes to admissions consulting, and when it comes to what gains you admission to the top and most selective institutions, sports serve essentially no role in your college application or helping you to achieve that objective of gaining admission to a highly selective school. if you are coming to the college and you are going to be an athlete, that is very different. You play a very specific niche role in the college community. If you're coming to the college and you are okay at football and now you're not playing football anymore, or you're just doing it in a club capacity, it doesn't really give anything to the institution that's of significant value, unfortunately. And so I know it's a harsh message for many people to hear, but sports add essentially zero value to students' applications who are applying to the most competitive schools. There might be a way to suck out some academic themes from a sport. There are things such as sports science, sports statistics, sports analytics that intersect with other fields, sports management, sports business. Hopefully next week, we will have an episode where we have a student who's faced with a little bit of a conundrum and dilemma here, who's very late in the admissions process. I'm hoping to have a case study of a student who had a lot of sports in their resume, the predominant, the predominant piece of their resume, and how you could squeeze some water out of a stone and maybe get some academic themes or some hooky themes out of sports if you ended up in that position, but you ideally don't want to. If you're aiming for the most selective schools, you want to have some more academically leaning activities and hooks. But the reason why I didn't include sports is because, except for a very small number of students who are very gifted and talented and excel in sports who will be recruited, it just serves essentially no admissions utility otherwise for the vast majority of students aiming for highly selective institutions. Second category that didn't make the list, music and instruments, very common, and its commonality is what has made it, again, unfortunately, a cliche for lack of a better term, and a dime a dozen. So there are too many students playing the piano, violin. I'm very big on, again, what the plot line is, beyond the baseline information and facts. What does this convey? If you're a student and you play the piano and you're from a privileged community, lands a lot differently than if you're a student who plays the piano and you're from the South Bronx or from Compton or from some very underserved, under-resourced school or community. I think we can all appreciate, I think if we all think for a second, if I think Upper East Side kid, New York City, piano, there's nothing there. Like, I'm like, okay, that makes sense, right? Like, they're kind of congruent. Very privileged backgrounds, something that tends to convey more privilege, piano, fancy, white collar, parents might have had the kid do it. If I said I have a kid from the South Bronx or some really weird countryside, town with 486 people, and they play the piano, like, it's different. We have all of these perceptions that are baked in based off of geography and culture and socioeconomic status, and they're all the same for admissions officers, right? So I think that there's a lot of stereotypes. There's the stereotype of the Asian violinist, and so I think there's a lot of capacity for students to simply commoditize themselves by just doing an activity that everybody else does, possibly an activity that's perceived as their parents forcing them to do it, an activity that maybe has cultural stereotypes, socioeconomic stereotypes, racial or ethnic connotations or stereotypes that will not benefit a student. And it just doesn't have any real upside. In a lot of cases, it's not relevant. Many students have music, but they're not positioning for music. If you are positioning for music in college and you're going to make that part of the narrative, then that's different. And some students are very on the back end, and they did a lot of music stuff, just like if you did a lot of sports, you might want to find a way to fit that into the narrative, right? So if the school has some music stuff, you might want to find a way to bend the narrative to make it relevant, right? But if you're a student who's very early in the process, or a parent of a student who's very early in the process, it wouldn't be ideal to go down a lot of those trajectories unless you understand the cost, that that's a lot of time commitment and a very low return on your investment if your goal is to get into a highly selective school. So you better really, really intrinsically love the sports or the music, because you're not going to get, and it's potentially going to be a lot of opportunity cost and interference with other time commitments that would be much more meaningful to your college application. So you have to understand, again, I'm not here to tell anybody what to do. I'm here to tell you, if you have X goals, what it takes, and to help engineer what it takes to achieve those goals and be very practical and realistic about it. Again, same thing for sports. If you're a student or you have a student and you are more in the exceptional class, and you are a very, very legitimate, extremely skilled, extremely talented musician, it's very very different, right? Then again, it might be something more along the lines of that actually starts to potentially become your hook. And obviously, there are other special considerations, such as for students who are conservatory students or going to very particular tracks that are very, oriented towards the arts or the fine arts. Then that is, those are separate considerations, but I don't want to get too off of the track. When I mention students who position themselves for pre-med, yes, there are BS-MD programs where you do actually have to know if you want to be a doctor by 18, but that's a very, very, very niche category. Same thing for student athletes and recruits. It's a very, very niche category. Most students who think they might be in play, they won't actually make it in terms of it being recruited, or they just won't be recruited at the school they really want to go to, which is another issue that many students face, where they're very marginal. They could do it maybe at this school, but it's not the school they want to go to, or they're like maybe a walk-on. That's a lot of students find themselves in that situation. That's very risky to devote a ton of time to something that's very unlikely to pay you dividends if your top goal is to go to one of these, a college and to have maximum optionality. So athletic recruits are much more niche, as our students who have exceptional level talent or ability are really planning on making that, a career focus and a real primary academic focus, because it's so niche. It's a little bit more off the beaten path. But obviously there would be special considerations for students who are extraordinarily talented or gifted in some of these other categories. I'm just marginalizing them because most students are not. And for many students, the vast, vast majority, these will not be effective strategic vehicles for gaining admission to top colleges, and they have extraordinary opportunity costs because they take a lot of time, and they take a lot of time away from other things that are actually effective strategic vehicles. Okay, that is it for this episode. We went quite long, but hopefully the detail is helpful to many people, and we will talk soon in the next episode. Bye-bye.